Hey, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a battlefield where the morning mist still clings to the blood-soaked earth, and in that liminal space between night and day, between life and death, you become aware of a presence that has haunted human consciousness since the first warrior raised a bronze blade against his neighbor, a force so primal and terrifying that ancient peoples could only comprehend it by giving it form, by creating stories that would help them understand the inexplicable fury that transforms ordinary men into instruments of destruction and ordinary disagreements into campaigns of annihilation that reshape the very landscape of civilization. And as you breathe in the metallic scent of blood mixed with the sweet corruption of bodies left too long under the Mediterranean sun, you begin to sense the invisible threads that connect this moment to every act of violence that has ever stained human history, threads that lead back through millennia to the very origins of warfare itself, to that first moment when our ancestors discovered that organized brutality could achieve what diplomacy and negotiation could not. And at the center of this web of violence and conquest stands a figure whose very name strikes fear into the hearts of mortals and immortals alike, whose presence on any battlefield guarantees that the outcome will be measured not in strategic advantage or political gain, but in the sheer tonnage of flesh and bone that fertilizes the earth with the dreams and hopes of those who believed they could return home to their families when the fighting ended. And this figure, this embodiment of everything that civilized society tries to contain and control, this god whose worship requires not incense and prayers but the screams of the dying and the clash of bronze against bronze, is ours, the most feared and reviled member of the Olympic pantheon, whose very existence serves as a reminder that beneath the thin veneer of culture and law that humans use to organize their societies lies a savage hunger for dominance that can only be satisfied through the systematic destruction of everything that others hold dear. You find yourself walking through the ruins of what was once a thriving city, its walls breached by siege engines and its streets littered with the detritus of conquest, and as your feet crunch on fragments of pottery that once held the oil and wine that sustained families through the long winter months, you can almost hear the echoes of the violence that transformed this place from a center of learning and commerce into a monument to the god of war's insatiable appetite for destruction. And in your mind's eye you see him as the ancient poets described him, a figure of terrible beauty whose physical perfection serves only to make his cruelty more shocking. His golden hair catching the light of burning buildings as he strides through the chaos of battle with the casual confidence of someone who knows that every wound inflicted and every life extinguished serves to strengthen his power and extend his influence over the mortal realm. And you understand that ours represents something far more complex and disturbing than simple brutality, for he embodies the paradox at the heart of human nature, the recognition that the same species capable of creating art and philosophy and systems of law complex enough to govern millions of people is also capable of organizing itself for the purpose of inflicting suffering on a scale that defies comprehension, transforming entire regions into landscapes of death where the survivors envy the fallen and the conquerors discover that victory tastes like ashes when they are forced to confront the magnitude of what they have destroyed in pursuit of their ambitions. The stories of ours begin not with his birth but with the recognition by early Greek communities that war was not simply an unfortunate necessity imposed by circumstance but a force of nature as fundamental and unstoppable as earthquakes or storms, a phenomenon that required explanation and propitiation if human societies were to have any hope of surviving its periodic visitations. And as you sit beside the well that once provided water for the agora where citizens gathered to debate the issues of their time, you can imagine the conversations that must have taken place as people struggled to understand how their neighbors could transform overnight from peaceful farmers and craftsmen into warriors capable of acts that seemed to emerge from some realm beyond human nature. And it was in response to this need to comprehend the incomprehensible that the figure of ours emerged from the collective unconscious of a civilization that had learned through bitter experience that peace was always temporary and that the capacity for violence lurked just beneath the surface of even the most refined and cultured societies, waiting for the right combination of fear, ambition, an opportunity to burst forth with a fury that would sweep away everything that previous generations had built with such care and patience and hope for the future. You walk among the olive groves that surround the ruined city, their ancient trees bearing witness to cycles of destruction and renewal that span centuries, their gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that has seen countless armies march beneath its vault. And as you rest in the shade of one particularly massive specimen whose trunk bears the scars of weapons that mark territorial boundaries in conflicts whose causes have been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars, you reflect on the stories that describe Ars as the son of Zeus and Hera, born from the union of the king of the gods and his queen, a parentage that speaks to the recognition that war emerges not from the margins of divine society but from its very center. From the conflicts and tensions that exist even among beings who possess the power to reshape reality according to their will. And the myths tell us that Hera conceived Ars not from love but from anger, her rage at Zeus's infidelities manifesting in the creation of a son who would embody all the destructive potential of uncontrolled emotion, whose very existence would serve as a constant reminder that even the gods are not immune to the passions that drive mortals to acts of unspeakable cruelty against their own kind. And in this divine family drama we can see reflected the human understanding that violence often emerges not from external threats but from the breakdown of relationships within communities, from the failure of the bonds that are supposed to hold societies together in the face of the centrifugal forces that constantly threaten to tear them apart. The earliest depictions of Ars in Greek art and literature present him not as a noble warrior defending his homeland but as a figure of pure aggression, a being who delights in conflict for its own sake rather than for any strategic or moral purpose. And as you examine the fragments of pottery and sculpture that archaeologists have recovered from sites across the Mediterranean, you begin to understand that the ancient Greeks viewed their god of war with a mixture of fear and disgust that reflects their ambivalent relationship with the violence that seemed to be an inescapable part of human existence. For while they recognized that military prowess was essential for the survival of their city-states in a world where stronger neighbors constantly threatened to absorb weaker ones, they also understood that the qualities that made a man effective in battle were precisely those that made him dangerous to his own community during peacetime. And so Ars became a repository for all the anxieties and contradictions that arose from the need to maintain warrior classes that could defend against external threats while remaining controllable when those threats had been neutralized, and the stories that describe his cowardice and his tendency to flee from battle when faced with superior opponents serve as a reminder that even the most fearsome warriors are ultimately motivated by the same self-preservation instincts that govern all living beings, making their willingness to risk everything in pursuit of glory or revenge all the more puzzling and terrifying to those who must live with the consequences of their actions. You find yourself standing before the remains of a temple that was once dedicated to Ars, its columns toppled and its altar cracked by the same forces of destruction that the god was supposed to embody and control. And as you run your hands over the weathered marble that still bears traces of the elaborate carvings that once depicted scenes of battle and conquest, you can almost feel the presence of the countless worshippers who came here seeking the god's favor before marching off to wars that would determine the fate of their families and their communities. And you wonder what prayers they offered to a deity who was known for his fickleness and his tendency to switch sides in the middle of conflicts, abandoning his previous allies to support their enemies based on nothing more than his momentary whims or his desire to prolong the fighting that fed his appetite for chaos and suffering. And the inscriptions that remain legible on the temple walls speak not of requests for victory or protection but of desperate pleas for the god to turn his attention elsewhere, to spare this particular city or army from the full force of his wrath, suggesting that even his most devoted followers understood that Ars was not a protector to be courted but a natural disaster to be deflected, a force that could be temporarily appeased but never truly controlled or predicted. And this relationship between god and worshipper reflects the broader Greek understanding that the universe operated according to principles that were often hostile to human welfare, and that survival required not the favor of benevolent deities but the ability to navigate between malevolent forces that viewed mortal concerns with indifference or active hostility. The myths surrounding Ars's romantic relationships reveal another dimension of his character that helps explain why the Greeks found him so disturbing and yet so fascinating. For his most famous liaison was with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, a pairing that seems to contradict everything we might expect about the relationship between violence and affection, yet which reflects the ancient understanding that passion and aggression are more closely linked than civilized society cares to acknowledge. And the stories of their secret meetings and the elaborate deceptions they employed to hide their affair from Aphrodite's husband Hephaestus speak to the recognition that love and war share certain fundamental characteristics, both involving the conquest of others' will, both requiring strategies and tactics that blur the line between persuasion and coercion, both producing casualties among those who become entangled in conflicts they never chose to join. And when Hephaestus finally discovered the affair and trapped the lovers in a net of unbreakable chains, exposing them to the ridicule of the other gods, the humiliation that Ars suffered serves as a reminder that even the most powerful and feared beings are vulnerable to forces beyond their control, that the very Qualities that make them formidable in some contexts can become sources of weakness when the circumstances change. And the laughter of the assembled deities at the sight of the war god caught in such an undignified position reflects the human tendency to find satisfaction in the downfall of those whose power seemed absolute, suggesting that the Greeks understood instinctively that no form of dominance is permanent and that those who live by violence must eventually confront the possibility of becoming victims of the same forces they once wielded against others. You walk through the ruins of what was once a military academy where young men from aristocratic families came to learn the arts of war, and as you sit on the steps of the building that housed their dormitories, you can imagine the conversations that must have taken place as these future leaders struggled to reconcile their education in philosophy and rhetoric with their training in weapons and tactics, for the contradiction between the Greek ideals of reason and moderation and the reality of a world that rewarded those who could organize and execute violence more effectively than their neighbors created tensions that permeated every aspect of their culture, and the figure of Ars served as a focus for these contradictions. Embodying everything that civilized society sought to transcend while remaining an essential component of any strategy for survival in a hostile world, and the young men who studied at this academy would have been taught to honor the god of war while also being warned about the dangers of allowing his influence to extend beyond the battlefield into the sphere of civilian life. For the history of Greek city-states is filled with examples of successful military commanders who proved incapable of adapting to peacetime leadership, their skills at inspiring troops and organizing campaigns becoming liabilities when applied to the more subtle challenges of governance and diplomacy. And the careers of figures like Alcibiades demonstrate how easily the qualities that Ars rewarded could become destructive when channeled into political rather than military contexts, leading to the kind of internal conflicts that weaken communities more effectively than any external enemy could hope to achieve through direct assault. The relationship between Ars and his divine siblings reveals additional layers of meaning in the Greek conception of war and its place in the cosmic order, for while his sister Athena was also associated with warfare, her role as a goddess of strategic thinking and defensive combat stood in sharp contrast to his representation of mindless aggression and the love of violence for its own sake, and this distinction reflects the Greek recognition that there were different types of military action. Some serving legitimate purposes like the protection of one's homeland or the enforcement of justice, while others emerged from baser motives like greed, vengeance, or the simple desire to dominate and humiliate one's enemies. And the stories that describe conflicts between the two war deities often center on this fundamental difference in motivation and methodology, with Athena's careful planning and concern for minimizing unnecessary casualties contrasting sharply with Ars's preference for prolonged campaigns that maximized opportunities for slaughter and destruction. And these divine conflicts serve as allegories for the choices that human leaders face when deciding how to respond to threats or pursue their objectives, suggesting that even in situations where violence seems inevitable, there remain moral and practical distinctions between different approaches to the application of force. And the Greeks consistently portrayed Athena as superior to her brother, not because she was more powerful but because she understood that true strength lies in the ability to achieve one's goals with minimal collateral damage, while Ars's appetite for carnage often undermined his own strategic objectives by creating unnecessary enemies and prolonging conflicts that could have been resolved more efficiently through targeted action. You climb the path that leads to a mountain shrine where warriors once came to make offerings before departing for campaigns in distant lands, and as you pause to catch your breath in the thin air that carries the scent of wild herbs and ancient stone, you contemplate the psychological burden that would have weighed on these men as they prepared to leave behind everything familiar and safe in order to participate in enterprises whose outcomes remained uncertain despite the most careful planning and preparation. For while modern military technology has changed the physical nature of warfare, the emotional and spiritual challenges faced by those who must kill and risk death for causes greater than themselves remain fundamentally unchanged across millennia. And the rituals that took place at shrines like this one served not only to invoke divine protection but also to help warriors mentally prepare themselves for experiences that would test every assumption they held about their own character and capabilities, forcing them to discover whether they possessed the courage and resilience necessary to function effectively in situations where split-second decisions could determine not only their own survival but the lives of their comrades and the ultimate success or failure of their mission. And the offerings left at this shrine speak to the complexity of the emotions that surrounded these departures, including not only fear and uncertainty but also excitement and anticipation, for despite its horrors, warfare has always attracted individuals who find in its challenges and dangers a form of meaning and purpose that peacetime existence cannot provide, and the cult of Ars acknowledged this aspect of human nature even as it warned about the costs and consequences of embracing violence too enthusiastically or too completely. The geographical distribution of Ars worship throughout the ancient Mediterranean world reveals patterns that reflect the political and military realities of different regions and time periods. For while the god's cult never achieved the widespread popularity of deities like Apollo or Demeter, whose domains encompassed aspects of life that all communities valued and needed, the worship of Ars flourished in areas where military conflict was a constant reality and where success in warfare determined not only political independence but economic survival and cultural continuity, and archaeological evidence suggests that his temples and shrines were most numerous in frontier regions where Greek settlements faced constant pressure from hostile neighbors. Places where the luxury of philosophical reflection on the nature of violence gave way to the immediate practical necessity of organizing effective resistance against existential threats, and in these environments the figure of Ars served not as an abstract embodiment of humanity's capacity for self-destruction but as a vital resource for communities that needed every possible advantage in their struggle for survival, and the rituals associated with his worship in these contexts emphasized not the horror and futility of war but its potential for creating opportunities and achieving objectives that could not be accomplished through peaceful means, suggesting that the Greeks understood instinctively that their ambivalent attitude toward violence was a luxury that could only be maintained by those who enjoyed sufficient security to contemplate the moral and philosophical implications of their actions rather than being forced to focus exclusively on their immediate effectiveness in neutralizing threats to their existence. You stand in the courtyard of a house that once belonged to a veteran of the Peloponnesian War, its walls decorated with frescoes that depict scenes of heroic combat alongside images of domestic tranquility, and as you study these artistic juxtapositions, you begin to understand how individuals who had experienced the extremes of human behavior represented by prolonged military campaigns struggled to integrate those experiences with their peacetime identities as citizens, fathers, and members of communities that valued cooperation and mutual support over competition and dominance. For the psychological transformation required to function effectively as a warrior created changes in personality and outlook that could not simply be reversed when the fighting ended. And many veterans found themselves caught between two incompatible sets of values and expectations, honored by their communities for their service while simultaneously viewed with suspicion and concern by those who recognized that the skills and attitudes necessary for military success could become sources of instability and conflict when applied to civilian contexts, and the worship of Ars provided a framework within which these contradictions could be acknowledged and partially resolved, offering rituals and narratives that help veterans process their experiences while also serving as warnings to the broader community about the costs of relying too heavily on military solutions to political and social problems. And the decline of his cult in later periods reflects the Roman preference for deities like Mars, whose association with warfare was balanced by connections to agriculture and other peaceful pursuits, suggesting a different cultural approach to the integration of military and civilian values that emphasized continuity rather than separation between different aspects of human experience. The philosophical implications of Ars worship extend far beyond questions of military strategy and tactics to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of human beings and their place in a universe that seems indifferent to their welfare and hostile to their aspirations for peace and security. For the recognition that violence plays an essential role in shaping historical developments forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the relationship between power and justice, between individual desires and collective needs, between the ideals that guide human behavior in theory and the compromises that practical circumstances often require, and the figure of Ars serves as a focal point for these philosophical tensions, embodying the recognition that moral progress and social development often require the use of methods that contradict the very values they are supposed to advance and protect, creating paradoxes that cannot be resolved through logical analysis but must be lived through and endured by each generation as it faces its own unique combination of challenges and opportunities. And the Greeks' complicated relationship with their god of war reflects their understanding that ethical behavior is not simply a matter of following predetermined rules but requires constant negotiation between competing claims and conflicting loyalties, and that the attempt to maintain absolute consistency in one's principles often leads to either paralysis in the face of genuine threats or self-deception about the true nature of one's actions and their consequences for others, suggesting that wisdom consists not in avoiding the moral ambiguities associated with the use of force but in developing the judgment necessary to distinguish between situations where violence serves legitimate purposes and those where it merely satisfies base impulses or serves narrow interests at the expense of broader human welfare. As you walk through the narrow streets of what was once a thriving port city, you pass the remnants of workshops where craftsmen once forged the weapons and armor that equipped the armies of competing city-states, and the specialized knowledge required to create these instruments of war reminds you that warfare has always been as much about technology and industrial capacity as about individual courage and skill, for the evolution of military equipment reflects broader developments in metallurgy, engineering, and organizational systems that connect the history of violence to the history of human innovation in ways that reveal the complex relationship between destructive and creative impulses in human culture. And the association of ours with the tools and techniques of warfare acknowledges this technological dimension of conflict while also recognizing that advances in weapons technology create new moral challenges by increasing the potential for causing harm while reducing the physical and emotional costs to those who wield these instruments. And the progression from bronze to iron weapons during the period when Greek culture was taking its classical form coincided with changes in military organization and tactics that transformed warfare from a primarily aristocratic activity governed by codes of honor and personal combat into a more democratic and systematic enterprise that emphasized coordination and discipline over individual heroism. And these changes required corresponding adjustments in the religious and cultural frameworks that societies used to understand and justify their military activities, leading to modifications in the worship of ours that reflected new realities about the nature of organized violence and its role in determining political outcomes and social relationships. The seasonal festivals associated with Ars worship reveal how ancient communities attempted to contain and channel the destructive energies that the god represented, creating ritualized occasions when aggression and competition could be expressed in controlled environments that minimized their potential for causing lasting damage to social bonds and community institutions. And these celebrations often involved mock battles, athletic competitions, and dramatic performances that allowed participants to experience the excitement and intensity of conflict without its usual consequences, providing outlets for impulses that might otherwise manifest in more destructive ways while also serving as training exercises that maintained military readiness during periods of peace. And the timing of these festivals typically coincided with seasons when agricultural work was less demanding and when young men had both the energy and the leisure time necessary to engage in the physical activities that prepared them for potential military service, creating annual cycles that synchronized the community's spiritual calendar with its practical needs for defense and internal order. And the decline of these festivals in later periods reflects broader changes in military organization and political structure that reduced the role of citizen soldiers while increasing reliance on professional armies whose training and loyalty operated according to different principles than those that governed traditional militia systems. And the replacement of community-based military service with contractual arrangements between states and mercenary companies represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between violence and citizenship that has continued to evolve throughout subsequent centuries, creating new challenges for societies that must maintain military capabilities while preserving democratic institutions and civilian control over the use of force. You find yourself sitting beside a spring that was once considered sacred to ours, its waters flowing from deep underground sources that connect this place to the chthonic powers that govern death and renewal. And as you listen to the gentle sound of water moving over stones that have been polished smooth by countless years of erosion, you reflect on the connections between warfare and the natural cycles that govern all life on Earth. For the Greeks understood that conflict serves essential functions in maintaining the health and vitality of communities by eliminating weak or corrupt elements and creating opportunities for new leadership and fresh approaches to persistent problems. And this biological metaphor for the role of violence in human society reflects observations about the behavior of other species where competition and aggression serve to strengthen populations by ensuring that only the most capable individuals survive to reproduce and pass on their characteristics to future generations. Yet the application of these natural principles to human communities raises profound questions about the relationship between individual worth and social utility, between personal rights and collective needs, between the values that guide behavior within groups and those that govern interactions between different communities. And the worship of ours provided a framework within which these tensions could be explored and partially resolved through rituals and narratives that acknowledged both the necessity and the tragedy of organized violence, recognizing that the preservation of cherished institutions and values sometimes requires actions that violate those same principles, creating moral burdens that cannot be eliminated but must be borne by those who accept responsibility for protecting others and maintaining the conditions necessary for civilized life to flourish in a world where predatory forces constantly threaten to overwhelm and destroy everything that previous generations have built through their labor, sacrifice, and dedication to ideals that transcend immediate self-interest. The iconography associated with Ars in ancient art reveals how visual representations of the god evolved in response to changing military technologies and tactical innovations. For early depictions show him armed with bronze weapons and wearing armor that reflects the fighting styles of the archaic period, when warfare consisted primarily of individual combat between aristocratic warriors who viewed battle as an opportunity to display their personal courage and skill, while later images incorporate the equipment and formations characteristic of hoplite warfare, where success depended more on discipline and cooperation than on individual prowess. And these artistic changes document broader transformations in Greek society that affected not only military organization but also political institutions, economic relationships, and cultural values. For the shift from heroic to collective models of warfare coincided with the development of democratic institutions that required citizens to subordinate their personal ambitions to collective decision-making processes while maintaining the individual initiative and responsibility necessary for effective military service. And the visual evolution of Ars reflects these tensions between old and new approaches to the organization of violence, showing him sometimes as a traditional hero equipped for single combat and sometimes as a commander capable of inspiring and coordinating the actions of large formations. And these dual representations acknowledge that effective military leadership requires both the physical courage associated with personal combat and the intellectual and emotional qualities necessary for managing complex operations involving thousands of participants whose individual contributions must be synchronized to achieve strategic objectives. And the continuing popularity of both types of imagery suggests that Greek audiences appreciated the complexity of military leadership while recognizing that different situations might require different approaches to the application of force and the motivation of troops who faced varying degrees of risk and uncertainty depending on their role in the overall campaign. The relationship between Ars and the concept of justice in Greek thought reveals fundamental tensions in the ancient understanding of how societies should respond to internal and external threats. For while the god of war was generally viewed as morally problematic due to his association with unnecessary violence and his apparent indifference to the causes for which battles were fought, there remained a recognition that force sometimes served legitimate purposes in defending the innocent and punishing those who violated community standards through their actions or their refusal to accept the authority of established institutions. And this tension between the corrupting influence of violence and its occasional necessity for maintaining social order created philosophical and practical dilemmas that could not be resolved through abstract reasoning but required case-by-case judgments about when the benefits of military action outweighed its costs and risks. And the Greeks attempted to address these dilemmas by distinguishing between different types of warfare, viewing defensive conflicts and those undertaken to enforce legal decisions or treaty obligations as more morally acceptable than wars of conquest or revenge. Yet even this distinction proved difficult to maintain in practice because the same military actions could serve multiple purposes simultaneously, and because the long-term consequences of allowing threats to develop often justified preemptive measures that appeared aggressive to outside observers but defensive to those who initiated them. And the worship of Ars acknowledged these complexities by portraying him as a force that could serve either just or unjust causes depending on the intentions and methods of those who invoked his power, suggesting that the moral significance of violence depends not on its inherent characteristics but on the context within which it occurs and the alternatives that were available to those who chose to employ it as a means of achieving their objectives. As darkness falls over the ancient landscape that surrounds you, the temperature drops and the sounds of nocturnal creatures begin to replace the songs of day birds, creating an atmosphere that seems appropriate for contemplating the darker aspects of human nature that Ars embodies. For it is in the quiet hours when normal social constraints are relaxed that individuals often confront thoughts and impulses that civilized society requires them to suppress during daylight hours. And the god of war represents not only the organized violence of formal military campaigns but also the potential for destructive behavior that exists within every human heart, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to manifest in ways that shock and disturb those who witness its emergence. And the Greeks understood that this capacity for violence was not an aberration or pathology but an integral part of the human condition that could not be eliminated through education or social engineering but only channeled and controlled through institutions and practices that provided alternative outlets for aggressive impulses while maintaining clear boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable forms of competitive behavior. And the nocturnal festivals associated with Ars worship often involved activities that deliberately evoked the atmosphere of actual combat, including bloodshed, pain, and the possibility of serious injury or death. creating experiences that allowed participants to explore their own capacity for violence in ritualized contexts that minimized the risk of lasting harm while providing insights into their own character and limitations that could not be gained through purely intellectual analysis or theoretical study of moral principles and their practical applications. The legacy of Ars worship in later periods reveals how different cultures adapted Greek religious concepts to serve their own political and military needs. For while the Romans eventually identified him with their own god Mars, they significantly modified his character and role to emphasize his connections to agriculture and the protection of the state rather than his association with chaotic and destructive violence, reflecting a different cultural attitude toward the relationship between military and civilian values that emphasized integration rather than separation between these spheres of activity. And this transformation of the god's identity demonstrates how religious concepts evolve in response to changing social conditions and political requirements, serving not as unchanging expressions of eternal truths but as flexible tools that communities use to understand and manage their experiences while maintaining continuity with their cultural heritage and historical traditions. And the persistence of certain elements of Ars worship in modified forms throughout the Mediterranean world suggests that the psychological and social needs that his cult addressed remained relevant even as the specific military and political challenges faced by different communities changed in response to technological innovations, economic developments, and shifts in the balance of power between competing civilizations. And the eventual decline of explicit Ars worship coincided with the rise of Christianity and other religious systems that offered different approaches to understanding the role of violence in human life while addressing many of the same fundamental questions about justice, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual desires and collective welfare that had motivated the original development of his cult among the ancient Greeks who struggled to comprehend the forces that shaped their world and determined the fate of their communities. You stand now at the edge of the sea where ancient ships once departed carrying soldiers to distant battles whose outcomes would determine the future of their civilization, and as you listen to the eternal rhythm of waves against the shore, you reflect on the continuity that connects the experiences of those long-dead warriors to the challenges faced by every generation that must decide how to respond to threats against everything they hold dear. For while the specific technologies and political arrangements that govern organized violence have changed dramatically over the millennia that separate us from the classical world, the fundamental human experiences of fear, courage, loyalty, and moral ambiguity that warfare entails remain essentially unchanged. And the figure of Ars continues to serve as a symbol for all the uncomfortable truths about human nature that civilized societies prefer to ignore or deny but cannot escape or overcome through wishful thinking or good intentions alone. And perhaps the most important lesson that can be drawn from the Greek understanding of their god of war is not that violence is inherently evil or that it can be eliminated through proper education and social organization, but rather that it is a permanent feature of the human condition that requires constant vigilance, careful management, and humble recognition of our own capacity for both creative and destructive behavior depending on the circumstances we face and the choices we make when confronted with situations that test our deepest values and most cherished beliefs about ourselves and our obligations to others. And in this recognition lies not despair but a kind of wisdom that accepts the tragic dimensions of human existence while maintaining hope that understanding and compassion can gradually reduce the frequency and intensity of conflicts that arise from misunderstanding, fear, and the failure to recognize our common humanity across the artificial boundaries that separate different communities and cultures. And as the stars emerge in the darkening sky above this ancient shore, you carry with you the knowledge that the struggle to balance the competing demands of security and morality, individual freedom and collective responsibility, justice and mercy will continue as long as conscious beings inhabit a universe that offers no guarantees about the outcomes of our efforts to create meaning and purpose from the raw materials of existence. And perhaps this is enough, this recognition that the questions are more important than the answers and that the attempt to live with dignity and compassion in the face of uncertainty and loss is itself a form of victory over the forces of chaos and destruction that Ars represents. And with this thought you turn away from the sea and begin the long journey home, knowing that tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities to test your understanding of what it means to be human in a world where the capacity for both love and war resides in every heart, waiting to be awakened by the circumstances that fate and choice will inevitably provide. The morning light finds you walking through olive groves that have witnessed countless generations of farmers who tended their trees between the wars that periodically swept across this landscape like seasonal storms, their patient cultivation of these ancient plants serving as a counterpoint to the sudden destruction that ours brought to their world. And as you touch the gnarled bark of trees that may have provided oil for the lamps that lit the homes of warriors preparing for battles whose names are now forgotten, you contemplate the strange relationship between creation and destruction that defines human civilization, for the same hands that could nurture life from soil and seed could also forge weapons capable of ending that life in an instant. And the god of war presided over this duality not as an external force imposing violence upon an otherwise peaceful species, but as an expression of contradictions that exist within the human heart itself, contradictions that no amount of philosophical reflection or moral education has ever succeeded in resolving, because they emerge from the fundamental conditions of existence in a world where resources are limited, desires are infinite, and different groups of conscious beings inevitably develop incompatible visions of how life should be organized and what goals are worth pursuing at the cost of conflict with others who hold equally sincere but irreconcilable beliefs about justice, truth, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective obligation. And the worship of ours provided ancient communities with a framework for acknowledging these contradictions without being paralyzed by them, recognizing that moral purity was a luxury that could not be maintained by those responsible for protecting the vulnerable and preserving the conditions necessary for cultural development and spiritual growth. And in this recognition there was both tragedy and wisdom, for it allowed people to act decisively when action was required while maintaining awareness of the moral costs that such action inevitably entailed, creating a form of ethical realism that avoided both the cynicism that treats all values as arbitrary preferences and the idealism that refuses to acknowledge the practical constraints within which moral choices must be made. You pause beside a stone marker that once indicated the boundary between two city-states whose rivalry led to a series of conflicts that ultimately weakened both communities and left them vulnerable to conquest by foreign powers, and as you read the weathered inscription that proclaims the territorial rights that seemed so important to the people who erected this monument, you reflect on how the worship of ours both reflected and reinforced the competitive dynamics that characterized relations between Greek communities, for while the god's cult acknowledged the tragic necessity of warfare, it also celebrated the martial virtues that made conflict more likely by encouraging young men to view military service as the highest form of civic participation and personal achievement, creating cultural pressures that made diplomatic solutions to disputes more difficult to achieve and sustain because they seemed to offer fewer opportunities for individuals to demonstrate their courage and loyalty while gaining the recognition and status that came from successful participation in campaigns that tested their physical and moral capabilities under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And this cultural emphasis on military excellence created what modern analysts might recognize as a security dilemma, where the steps that each community took to ensure its own protection increased the perceived threat to its neighbors, leading to arms races and preventive wars that served no rational political purpose but satisfied psychological needs for agency and control in a world where most aspects of human existence remain subject to forces beyond individual or collective influence. And the figure of ours embodied both the benefits and the dangers of this martial culture, representing the strength and determination that enabled small communities to maintain their independence against more powerful enemies, while also symbolizing the pride and aggression that prevented them from finding peaceful solutions to conflicts that ultimately damaged all participants regardless of which side could claim military victory when the fighting finally ended. The archaeological evidence from battlefields associated with Ars worship reveals the material reality that underlied the mythological narratives, for the remains of weapons, armor, and human bones tell stories of violence that was neither glorious nor heroic but brutal and chaotic, characterized more by fear, pain, and confusion than by the nobility and honor that literary sources attribute to ancient warfare. And this disconnect between idealized representations and historical reality reflects the psychological need to find meaning in experiences that threaten to overwhelm the human capacity for understanding and acceptance. For the traumatic nature of combat created memories that could not be integrated into normal consciousness without some form of interpretive framework that transformed senseless suffering into purposeful sacrifice, and the myths surrounding ours served this function by providing narratives that explained why violence was necessary and how it contributed to larger cosmic purposes that justified the immediate costs in human life and social stability. Yet the gods' complex and often contradictory character suggests that these explanatory frameworks were never entirely convincing even to those who created and transmitted them. for the stories consistently portray him as an unreliable and morally ambiguous figure whose interventions in human affairs often produced outcomes that satisfied no one and whose loyalty could not be counted upon by any side in a conflict. And this ambivalence reflects the Greek understanding that war was not a solution to human problems but a symptom of deeper issues that could not be addressed through military means alone, requiring political, economic, and cultural changes that were much more difficult to achieve than battlefield victories, but far more important for the long-term welfare of communities that sought to create sustainable foundations for prosperity and peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. As you climb a hill that overlooks the site of an ancient battlefield, you can see how the landscape still bears subtle traces of the earthworks and fortifications that once channeled the movement of armies whose clash determined the political future of this region. And the persistence of these marks in the terrain reminds you that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the immediate participants to affect subsequent generations who must live with the environmental, economic, and social damage that warfare inevitably produces. For the resources consumed in military campaigns represent investments that cannot be made in infrastructure, education, or cultural development, creating opportunity costs that compound over time and may ultimately prove more significant than the immediate strategic objectives that motivated the original decision to resort to force. And the worship of Ars reflected awareness of these broader consequences through rituals and narratives that emphasized the importance of limiting conflicts in scope and duration while maintaining the capability to respond effectively to genuine threats that could not be addressed through negotiation or other peaceful means. And the god's association with specific types of weapons and tactical formation suggests that his cult evolved in response to technological and organizational innovations that changed the nature of warfare while requiring corresponding adjustments in the cultural and religious frameworks that societies used to understand and justify their military activities. And these adjustments demonstrate the dynamic relationship between religious belief and practical experience that characterizes all living traditions. For the meaning and significance of divine figures like ours cannot be separated from the historical contexts within which their worship developed and the specific challenges that their devotees faced in trying to maintain their communities and preserve their values in a world where survival often required actions that contradicted those same values. The seasonal cycle of agricultural work that governed life in ancient Mediterranean communities created natural rhythms that influenced both the timing of military campaigns and the religious observances associated with war gods like ours. For the practical necessity of coordinating planting and harvesting activities with the demands of military service meant that conflicts typically occurred during specific months when men could be spared from farming without jeopardizing the food supply that sustained their families and communities. And this seasonal pattern of warfare created corresponding patterns in religious activity, with festivals honoring us often scheduled to coincide with the periods when military campaigns were most likely to begin or end, providing opportunities for communities to seek divine favor for upcoming operations or to offer thanks for successful conclusions to previous conflicts. And these ritualized connections between agricultural and military cycles reflect the fundamental interdependence of different aspects of ancient life, where the same individuals who fought in wars also planted crops and raised livestock, where the wealth that supported military equipment and training came primarily from agricultural surplus, and where the ultimate goal of most conflicts was control over fertile land and the communities that worked it. And the integration of Ars worship into these broader patterns of seasonal observance helped to normalize warfare as a regular feature of human existence, while also emphasizing its subordination to the larger rhythms of production and reproduction that sustained life itself, suggesting that even the most martial aspects of Greek culture remained grounded in practical recognition of the economic and social foundations that made military activity possible and meaningful. You walk along an ancient road that once carried armies between the major cities of this region, its stone surface worn smooth by countless feet and hooves and wheels, and as you follow its winding path through landscapes that have changed little since classical times, you imagine the conversations that must have taken place among soldiers making this same journey 2.5 millennia ago, their discussions likely focusing on the same mixture of practical concerns and philosophical questions that preoccupy military personnel in every age. For the experience of being separated from family and familiar surroundings while facing the possibility of violent death creates psychological pressures that transcend differences in technology, political organization, or cultural background. And the figure of Ars provided these ancient warriors with a focus for their anxieties and hopes, a divine embodiment of the forces they sought to understand and control through their own actions and sacrifices. Yet the gods' unpredictable nature and moral ambiguity meant that even the most devout worshippers could never be certain that their prayers would be answered or that their offerings would guarantee protection from the hazards they faced, and this uncertainty reflects the broader human condition of having to make decisions and take actions without complete knowledge of their consequences or assurance that good intentions will produce beneficial outcomes. And perhaps the most valuable aspect of Ars worship was not its promise of divine intervention but its acknowledgement that uncertainty and risk are inescapable features of existence that must be faced with courage and determination regardless of the odds of success or the possibility that one's efforts may ultimately prove futile or counterproductive. And in this acceptance of tragedy as an inherent aspect of human life there was a kind of dignity that enabled individuals to act decisively even when they could not be certain that their actions were correct or that their sacrifices would achieve the goals for which they were undertaken. The evolution of Ars worship throughout the classical period reflects broader changes in Greek society that affected everything from political institutions to artistic expression. For as city-states grew larger and more complex, the intimate relationship between individual citizens and their military obligations began to change in ways that required corresponding modifications in the religious and cultural frameworks that explained and justified these obligations, and the god of war gradually became associated less with personal heroism and individual combat than with the organizational and logistical challenges of coordinating large-scale military operations involving thousands of participants whose individual contributions had to be synchronized to achieve strategic objectives. And this shift from heroic to bureaucratic models of warfare created new tensions between traditional values that emphasized personal courage and honor and emerging realities that required subordination of individual initiative to collective discipline and systematic planning. And the worship of Ars evolved to address these tensions by incorporating elements that celebrated both types of military virtue while acknowledging that different situations might require different approaches to the application of force and the motivation of troops who faced varying degrees of risk and uncertainty depending on their role in the overall campaign. And the persistence of both heroic and organizational elements in later representations of the god suggests that Greek audiences recognized the complexity of effective military leadership and the need to maintain flexibility in responding to different types of challenges while preserving core values that connected contemporary practice to ancestral traditions and cultural identity. As the sun reaches its zenith and the Mediterranean heat begins to shimmer off the stone surfaces around you, you seek shade beneath an ancient oak tree that has survived centuries of human conflict while continuing to mark the seasons with its patient cycle of growth and dormancy. And as you rest against its massive trunk, you reflect on the relationship between natural and human time scales that gives perspective to all historical events. For while the battles and conquests that seemed so important to their participants have faded into archaeological fragments and half-remembered stories, the fundamental processes of life and death, growth and decay, continue according to patterns that operate independently of human ambitions and fears. And the figure of Ars represents humanity's attempt to find meaning and purpose within these larger patterns while recognizing that individual lives and even entire civilizations are temporary phenomena that must accept their place within cycles of change that extend far beyond any single generation's capacity to influence or control. And this temporal perspective provides both humility and consolation, for it suggests that the struggles and sacrifices that define human experience have significance within their proper context, even though they may seem insignificant when measured against cosmic time scales or geological processes. And the worship of war gods like Ars serve to connect immediate practical concerns with these broader philosophical questions, providing frameworks for understanding how individual actions relate to collective purposes and how temporary events contribute to longer-term historical developments that shape the conditions within which subsequent generations must make their own choices about how to respond to the challenges and opportunities that their particular historical moment presents to them. The artistic representations of Ars that adorn temples, public buildings, and private homes throughout the ancient world reveal the complex relationship between aesthetic values and military culture. For while the god was consistently portrayed as physically perfect and clothed in magnificent armor, these idealized images stood in sharp contrast to the reality of warfare as experienced by ordinary soldiers who faced disease, exhaustion, hunger, and wounds that left survivors permanently disabled, even when they did not prove fatal. And this disconnect between artistic idealization and lived experience reflects the psychological need to find beauty and meaning in activities that were necessary for survival but inherently destructive and traumatic. and the artistic tradition surrounding Ars worship served to preserve and transmit cultural values that emphasized courage, loyalty, and sacrifice while providing inspirational models that encouraged individuals to aspire to standards of behavior that transcended immediate self-interest and personal comfort. Yet the persistence of these idealized representations also created unrealistic expectations that made it more difficult for veterans to process their experiences and reintegrate into civilian society after exposure to combat conditions that revealed the gap between heroic mythology and practical reality, and this tension between ideal and reality continues to characterize military culture in all subsequent periods, suggesting that the psychological and social challenges associated with organized violence remain fundamentally unchanged despite technological innovations that have transformed the tactical and strategic dimensions of warfare while leaving its essential human costs unaltered. You continue your journey through landscapes that bear the layered evidence of multiple civilizations, each of which has left its own interpretation of the relationship between violence and social order in the form of fortifications, weapons, and religious monuments that reflect different approaches to the eternal human challenge of maintaining security while preserving the values and institutions that make life meaningful beyond mere survival. And as you examine the architectural remains of successive cultures that occupied this same territory, you can trace the evolution of military technology and tactical thinking through changes in defensive structures and urban planning that reveal how each generation adapted to new threats while building upon the foundations laid by their predecessors. And the continuity of Ars worship across these cultural transitions suggests that the psychological and spiritual needs addressed by war gods transcend specific political arrangements or technological configurations, reflecting deeper aspects of human nature that remain constant even as surface conditions change in response to innovation, migration, conquest, and other historical forces that reshape the material conditions of existence without necessarily altering the fundamental challenges that conscious beings face in trying to create meaning and purpose from the raw materials of experience. And perhaps this continuity provides the most important insight into the significance of figures like Ars. For their persistence across millennia suggests that they address questions and concerns that are inherent in the human condition rather than mere products of particular historical circumstances or cultural arrangements that can be outgrown through progress or eliminated through education and social reform. The decline of explicit Ars worship in later periods coincided with the rise of philosophical and religious systems that offered different approaches to understanding the role of violence in human affairs while continuing to grapple with many of the same fundamental questions about justice, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual desires and collective welfare that had motivated the original development of his cult, and the transformation of war gods into more abstract concepts like honor, duty, and patriotism represents not the elimination of the psychological and social functions that these deities once served, but their incorporation into secular ideologies and institutional structures that perform similar roles in organizing collective responses to threats while maintaining social cohesion during periods of crisis and uncertainty. And this evolution demonstrates the flexibility and adaptability of human cultural systems that must constantly adjust to changing conditions while preserving essential functions that enable communities to survive and flourish across generations. And the study of how ancient peoples understood and worshipped figures like Ars provides insights into the continuing challenge of balancing the competing demands of security and morality, individual freedom and collective responsibility that define political life in every age and require constant negotiation rather than permanent resolution, because the specific form that these tensions take varies with historical circumstances while their underlying structure remains fundamentally unchanged as long as conscious beings must live together in communities that depend upon cooperation for their survival while remaining composed of individuals whose personal interests and values inevitably conflict in ways that cannot be resolved through purely rational discussion or appeal to universal principles that all parties accept as authoritative and binding. As evening approaches and the temperature begins to cool, you find yourself standing before the ruins of a small shrine where individual soldiers once came to make private offerings before departing for campaigns whose outcomes would determine not only their own fate but the future of their families and communities. And the intimate scale of this sacred space contrasts sharply with the grand temples where state ceremonies honored the god on behalf of entire populations, suggesting that Ars worship operated on multiple levels that reflected different aspects of the relationship between violence and human experience. From the personal anguish of individuals who faced the possibility of killing and dying to the collective responsibility of communities that had to decide when and how to use force in pursuit of their goals. And these different scales of religious observance provided frameworks for processing different types of moral and emotional challenges while maintaining connections between individual experience and larger social purposes that gave meaning to personal sacrifice and collective effort. And the archaeological evidence from sites like this one reveals the diversity of offerings that worshippers brought to their god, including weapons and armor that they hoped would provide protection in battle alongside personal items that connected their military service to their identity as members of families and communities that extended beyond the immediate context of warfare. And these diverse offerings reflect the complex relationship between military and civilian identity that characterized ancient Greek culture, where the same individuals who served as soldiers also participated in economic, political, and cultural activities that required different skills and values than those emphasized in military training, creating tensions between different aspects of personality and social role that could not be easily resolved but had to be managed through institutions and practices that acknowledged their legitimacy while providing mechanisms for mediating between competing claims and obligations. The philosophical legacy of Greek thinking about war and its divine embodiment continues to influence contemporary discussions about violence, justice, and political obligation, for the tensions that ancient peoples addressed through the worship of figures like ours remain central to modern debates about when force is justified, how military action should be conducted, and what obligations societies have to those who serve in their armed forces. And while the specific religious frameworks that once provided answers to these questions no longer command widespread acceptance, the underlying issues persist in forms that would be recognizable to ancient Greek citizens who struggled to understand how their commitments to reason, democracy, and human dignity could be reconciled with their dependence on military force for protection against enemies who did not share these values or respect these institutions. And the failure to resolve these contradictions through philosophical analysis or political reform suggests that they reflect fundamental features of the human condition rather than temporary problems that can be solved through better understanding or more effective social organization. And perhaps the most valuable insight that can be drawn from the study of ancient war gods is the recognition that moral progress does not require the elimination of these contradictions but rather the development of wisdom and humility that enables individuals and communities to live with them while making decisions that minimize unnecessary suffering while preserving the conditions necessary for human flourishing across generations. And in this ongoing struggle to balance competing values and obligations, there is both tragedy and nobility, for it requires accepting responsibility for choices whose consequences cannot be fully known or controlled while maintaining hope that understanding and compassion can gradually reduce the frequency and intensity of conflicts that arise from fear, misunderstanding, and the failure to recognize common humanity across the artificial boundaries that separate different groups and cultures. The night sounds of insects and small animals create a subtle symphony that connects this ancient landscape to the living world that continues to flourish despite the countless human dramas that have played out across its stage. And as you prepare to conclude your journey through the realm of ours, you reflect on the strange comfort that comes from recognizing that the challenges and contradictions that defined ancient peoples' relationship with their war god remain essentially unchanged in contemporary life. For this continuity suggests that current struggles with questions of violence, justice, and moral responsibility are not signs of failure or inadequacy but natural consequences of the human condition that require ongoing attention and care rather than definitive solutions. And perhaps the greatest gift that the study of figures like ours can provide is this perspective that places contemporary difficulties within a larger historical context while offering models of how previous generations have grappled with similar challenges without losing their essential humanity or abandoning their commitment to values that transcend immediate practical concerns. And in this recognition there is both realism about the persistence of certain types of problems and hope that wisdom accumulated over millennia can inform current decisions while providing resources for maintaining dignity and purpose in the face of uncertainty and loss. And as the stars emerge in the darkening sky above this place where ancient peoples once sought to understand the mysterious forces that shaped their world, you carry with you the knowledge that their questions remain your questions and that their struggles continue in every choice you make about how to respond to threats and opportunities while maintaining your integrity and your connections to others who share the privilege and burden of consciousness in a universe that offers no guarantees about the outcomes of human effort but rewards courage, compassion, and the willingness to keep searching for meaning and purpose even when definitive answers remain elusive. And with this understanding you can face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring while remaining connected to the long tradition of human beings who have struggled to live with dignity and hope in a world where the capacity for both love and war resides in every heart, waiting to be awakened by circumstances that will test your understanding of what it means to be human in the fullest and most demanding sense of that ancient and honored word. And perhaps this is enough, this recognition that the questions are eternal while the answers must be discovered anew by each generation and each individual who accepts responsibility for contributing to the ongoing conversation between consciousness and cosmos that gives meaning to existence while acknowledging its ultimate mystery. And in this acceptance there is peace.